Welcome to this video demonstration of the Intensive Support Team Advanced Flow Demand and Capacity Model. This is one of a series of tutorial videos on the suite of modelling tools available for different components of elective patient care pathways. This video will deal specifically with the Advanced Flow Model last updated as of the 26th of January 2017, version 2.02 FII. Please ensure that the copy you have downloaded matches this to avoid any possible confusion. This video is intended to provide an introduction to the model which should familiarise users with the layout of the model, the data requirements, and the outputs of the model. Before you start the process of modelling your service, please ensure that you have carried out the following. Read the Welcome tab on the model, orientate yourself to the populated example, engage with both information and operational staff involved in the care pathway, and that you agree on the underlying assumptions that you have made in generating the data. Ensure that you are familiar with the copy and paste special values method, which we shall go through in more detail a bit later. And don't be afraid of what's in front of you. This model does two things. It allows you to understand the variation in weekly demand and compare this against your average weekly capacity. And it calculates an estimated ideal waiting list size and compares this against the current waiting list size. In doing this, it allows you to understand how much capacity you need to provide to keep pace with demand, allowing for variation, and how much additional capacity is required to clear an excess waiting list, for example, if the current list is too big. The flow model differs from the other demand and capacity models in that it considers first outpatient, follow-up outpatient, and admissions as part of an integrated flow process, where activity in one aspect may have knock-on effects further downstream. Regardless of this additional complexity, however, the fundamentals underpinning the demand capacity calculations remain the same, as we will shortly see.
We will begin the video tutorial with the Welcome tab. The Welcome tab provides some initial notes regarding the purpose of the model, the data items that are required in order to generate results, the basic assumptions that underpin the calculations used within it, and its limitations. At the bottom of the sheet, there is a list of all the tabs within the workbook, with a brief description of each tab. Looking at the requirements, you will need up to 52 weeks of referral data, broken down by week and priority. You will also need activity data over the same period as your referral data, comprising of attendance and non-attendance figures. The non-attendance figures will need to be split by non-attendances resulting in a lost slot, such as DNAs, and non-attendances where the slot could be rebooked for another patient, such as cancellations ahead of the TCI date. You'll need an understanding of the number of rebookings that take place following a non-attendance where a slot was lost, such as a DNA. You will also need waiting list figures covering the current date, start and end with the period covered by your referral data, and removals from the waiting list for reasons other than treatment or ROT, excluding discharges due to non-attendances. And finally, you will need an understanding of the capacity for your service. You will need a set of each of these figures for new and follow-up outpatients, as well as for admissions. It's important that the data you enter is an accurate as possible representation of your current service, so please ensure that you enter a period which will reflect this. In terms of the limitations of the model, it's important to note that, as with any model, this workbook represents a numerical approximation of real-life events, so please be careful when interpreting the results. Anything that is produced by these models is sense-checked against operational experience. Discussing the implications of the outputs with operational staff is an excellent method of sense-checking, as such staff will frequently be in tune with what's going on. Finally, a few general tips. Always begin with a blank spreadsheet. These worksheets are complex and it's easy to overlook minor changes which may affect the final output, so downloading a fresh template at the start of the process is highly recommended. Check any tick box options and slider position the data entry boxes before proceeding. This worksheet uses a system whereby sliders that are set to the far right will pull values from previously completed data tables. Sliders that are set anywhere else are effectively inputting the data directly without considering historic information. The input boxes will highlight when this occurs by providing the historic values in brackets. As with any Excel workbook, the tabs can be moved around to suit the user, and blank tabs can be added as desired. We would recommend that you use the Notes section or add a worksheet to record details of any assumptions you make in the process of extracting the data that will populate the sheet, as well as any information regarding what you are using the outputs for, as this will assist in keeping track of your thought processes, as well as version control. If you find yourself comparing particular tabs regularly, then moving the tabs to make them adjacent may also be a helpful action.
So in summary, ensure that you are capable of extracting the data items needed to populate the model. This will consist of up to 52 weeks worth of referral data, as well as activity data covering the same period. Activity data, which includes first outpatient, follow-up outpatient and admitted activity, and consists of attendance figures as well as non-attendance and rebooking information. Waiting list information for first outpatient and admitted patients, and the number of patients removed from your waiting list for reasons other than treatment, or ROT, and the capacity information for your service. Clearly define the questions that you want to ask and make sure that all staff involved in the process have a thorough understanding of the terminology being used. This model provides an approximation of real-life events. The results need to be sense-checked with operational staff. Make sure that you begin with a blank template, check your tick box options and slider positions before starting, and use the existing notes worksheet or add a worksheet to record your assumptions. Information is what you will be using the outputs for, keeping track of thought processes and version control. Move the tabs around as you find most convenient. Once you start, this is your model. I'm now going to hand over to Keith, who is going to go through the demand and SPC section.
We will now move on to the Demand tab. This worksheet provides you with the option to enter the name of your trust and its specialty. Either select from the drop-down boxes or type the text in manually. Text that is entered or selected here will be reflected in some of the charts that we'll see later on in this video. There are two main data items that are entered on this sheet: historic referral data and current waiting list sizes. The referral data is split by priority, urgent and routine, and is entered on a per-week basis. Note that the total columns on this page are calculated from the urgent and routine totals and cannot be adjusted by users. There are also two boxes where you can enter the current first outpatient waiting list size and the current admitted waiting list size, either by using the sliders or by typing the value directly into the boxes. Note that this does not draw from any other data source. Pushing the slider to the far right will simply provide a maximum value. The numbers contained within these boxes should be the latest waiting list sizes for patients both with and without an appointment or TCI date. These values will change weekly and should be updated every week whilst working through the process to populate the module. This is important as it will allow you to make a comparison of the ideal or maximum sustainable waiting list sizes against the most current reported waiting list sizes in your final signed-off version. We will now go to the SPC tab, which will be used to calculate the information entered in the Demand tab. The SPC tab is a helpful way of visualizing the referral information you entered under the Demands tab. SPC stands for Statistical Process Control, and a chart such as this is used to assess whether a particular process, referrals received in this case, demonstrates a level of variability that is in line with what would be expected from a statistical viewpoint. To put it another way, the charts help you to see if there are any outliers in your data or if there are any unusual patterns in your demand. There may be points highlighted with a red tag, as visible here. These highlight instances of what is called special cause variation, that is, variation that is outside of the expected norm. The tag shows two numbers. Top indicates the type of special cause variation. The demand and capacity models allow for 4 types, which are listed here. The bottom number on the tag indicates the week the event took place. It's worth noting that an instance of special cause variation does not automatically invalidate your dataset. There may be reasons that justify an especially low level of referrals. Public holidays such as Christmas are an excellent example of this. When looking at the information on this tab, it's worth considering the following points about the referral data. Is it reasonably representative of what you expect to be seeing in the future? Are there any ongoing trends, upwards or downwards, that you expect to continue into the future? Are there any instances of special cause variation that may be indicative of issues with your data or processes which may bias the information you have entered? Check any highlighted such points and ensure you can account for them. If there are significant changes in referral activity that occur partway through your reference period, or if there are indications of an ongoing trend in referral patterns, there are some ways to adjust the inputs to account for this. A word of caution, however, if you are inferring trends from your data that suggest significant changes from your current levels of activity, make sure that these trends are real and not due to reasons such as data quality or seasonality issues. Actual step changes in referral activity tend to be very rare, and the saying of extraordinary claims requiring extraordinary proof is applicable here. With this warning in mind, the split function allows you to chop the left-hand side of the data off and base demand calculations on the right-hand side of the data only. An alternative method to using the split function is to enter the data for the period of interest only and leave the remaining rows blank. If you choose to use this method, please ensure that you also adjust your activity values accordingly. The workbook will assume that the referral and activity values entered cover the same time period and calculate demand and waiting list figures based on this. Be aware that the robustness of your data will decrease with fewer data points. In summary, referral data and waiting list sizes are entered on the Data tab, and referral activity can be visually assessed for anomalies on the SPC tab.
So in summary, the Data tab is where historic referral data and current waiting list sizes are entered. Referral data is split by priority, urgent and routine. Enter this data on a per week basis. Please note total columns cannot be adjusted by the user. Keep the waiting list figures up to date on a weekly basis to ensure that the final sign-off version is based on the most current reported waiting list sizes. The SPC tab provides a visualization of the referral information. This will allow you to check your data for unusual patterns of behavior which may indicate data quality issues or other process issues that require further investigation before proceeding. Key points to check on the SPC tab are: is it reasonably representative of what you expect to be seeing in the future? Are there any ongoing trends that you expect to continue into the future? Are there any instances of special cause variation that may be indicative of issues with your data or your processes? These may bias the information you have entered, so check any highlighted points and ensure that you can account for them. If you do take trends from these data, then you must be absolutely sure that the trends are real. Investigate and check them before you use these values to inform your operational decisions. Keith is now going to go through the outpatient capacity and admitted capacity tabs.
We will now look at the capacity tabs, which consist of an outpatient element and an admitted element. The outpatient capacity tab allows you to enter up to 100 clinics and their associated capacity under the core capacity table. This is shown in a diary format split by day of week and time session, or morning and afternoon splits, and the column at the end allows you to specify the frequency with which the clinic runs. There's a second table beneath the core table where you may enter additional capacity. This would be capacity that you anticipate taking place that lies outside of your day-to-day clinics, such as weekend working, waiting list illusives, and so forth. Below the capacity tables are historic activity tables, where you can enter the activity that took place over a 52-week period, split by core and additional activity as per the capacity tables above. The upshot of having these two sets of tables is that users can view their demand and capacity balance against their expected capacity or compare it against what activity took place the previous year to see if it's sufficient to meet demand. The capacity values can be switched between the capacity and historic activity tables using these boxes. As a word of warning, be very clear what question you want to ask and what data sources you are using before you read the summary values, as it's very easy to toggle a switch and take the wrong figures. The selection boxes at the top of the page allow you to pull either the capacity values from the data as entered or input them directly using the sliders. Note that the calculated values are shown in brackets if direct data entry via the sliders is used. In this case, the figures have been entered directly using sliders to provide the mean, new, and follow-up capacities per week. This is not something we would normally recommend, as the process of assessing the capacity is often very helpful in providing insight into operating processes. If you do not want this to occur, then ensure the sliders are pushed to the far right. Note that you can access the additional capacity calculator and the historic activity tables using these links at the top of the worksheet, and return to the top of the worksheet using links above each of the respective tables. To return to the point of how useful determining capacity can be, obtaining an agreed measure of capacity is frequently a point of significant challenge in the demand and capacity process. This will often be due to a number of factors. For example, capacity being changed reactively to meet demand requirements, or clinics configured in particular ways due to historic reasons that may not otherwise make much sense. Gaining a clear idea of the capacity of your service will often be beneficial in and of itself, as it may highlight processes that could be improved as part of the capacity assessment process. It's worth reviewing the findings from this page with operational staff. Consulting with the booking staff is an excellent sense check, as they will frequently have a good feel for what's occurring on the ground and can confirm the figures are a reasonable reflection of what is actually happening. The admitted capacity tab is very similar in layout to the outpatient capacity tab, with the only difference being that each row represents a theatre session rather than a clinic. There are provisions for core capacity, additional capacity, and historic activity, core and additional, with the same set of switches and sliders for pulling through information. This model is designed for patients on an active waiting list. In other words, it does not consider patients who are waiting for an admission for a planned procedure, such as removal of metalwork in orthopedics. If you have a significant volume of planned activity which you typically accommodate on your elective waiting lists, then the weekly admitted capacity for active waiters needs to be reduced to protect this capacity. A simple workaround is, outside of the model, to make an assessment of the typical number of planned cases that need to be accommodated per week, and to enter this on the admitted capacity sheet as a separate line. This line should be labeled capacity reserved for planned cases. The typical weekly number should be entered as a negative number on the Sunday PN list, and the number of weeks per year set to 52. If you are entering the data directly, you can adjust the slider values directly yourself. Either of these methods will have the effect of reducing the available weekly capacity for active waiters by this number.
So in summary, there are two capacity tabs, outpatient capacity and admitted capacity. You can enter up to 100 core clinics in the outpatient tab and 50 surgical lists in the admitted capacity tab. The capacity tabs allow users to enter their anticipated capacity in two ways. Either using the core and additional capacity tables, which will calculate the values based on the aggregation of clinic or theatre list figures, or using historic activities, which will compare historic activity against expected demands. Note that these are two different questions, so please be clear on which you think is the most relevant to your needs before proceeding. It is important to note that this model is designed for patients on an active waiting list. If a significant part of your elective capacity is dedicated to planned or urgent procedures, ensure that you either account for this in your capacity estimates or remove it by entering the typical number of slots used as a negative number in the capacity calculator. I'm now going to hand back to Keith. He's going to go through the Activity tab and the Parameters tab.
We will now look at the Activity and Parameters tab. The Activity tab is where users entered the activity metrics over the reference period: attendances, non-attendances resulting in a lost slot, and where a slot could be reused, and patients discharged following each of the non-attendance types. These metrics are repeated for first outpatient, follow-up outpatients, and inpatients. I'd like to highlight the significance of the difference between the non-attendance types. Non-attendances resulting in a lost slot will generally cover same-day non-attendances, such as DNAs, but may include patients who cancel within, for example, 2 to 3 days, where it may not be practically possible to call in a patient on short notice. Please bear this in mind when entering data into this sheet, as this will have an effect on the calculation of the number of additional slots required for rebookings. The follow-up activity section includes an additional option to include the number of follow-up patients past their due date. If your service has a significant number of these patients, these should be considered a potential clinical risk first and foremost, and will need to be assessed accordingly. From a demand and capacity perspective, these patients will also affect the calculation of the first to follow-up ratio, as they represent a hidden demand for follow-up capacity. Entering account of these patients here will assist in providing a more accurate representation of your service in that regard. This is a relatively crude methodology, but provides a guide as to the first to follow-up ratio if these patients had been seen. It's worth noting that the sliders on this sheet are direct input tools only, and do not follow the rule of pulling the data from historic tables when pulled to the far right. Figures can be entered manually into the boxes if you find this easier than using the sliders. The Parameters tab pulls information from the Demand tab and the Activity tab in the form of a number of metrics. Thus, these sliders are pulled to the far right, as they will be pulling historic data or using historic data in their calculations. As with any other variables, these can be manually set or changed using the sliders. So they can be used, for example, if you want to look at different scenarios. In your Assumptions tab, you should document the rationale for your decision. As with other calculated metrics, if you change a value from that calculated from data in the Activity tab, the old value will be shown in brackets. Note that the first to follow-up ratio will also provide a prompt to highlight if it is using the follow-up's past due date information as part of its calculations. Some of the metrics shown here may be useful for sense-checking purposes, such as the first to follow-up ratio and the first attendance to DTA ratio. Anything which diverges significantly from operational experience should be followed up as a matter of course.
So, in summary, there are 4 types of activity data entered onto the Activity tab: attendances, non-attendances resulting of a lost slot, and non-attendances where the slot was reused, and patients discharged following each of the non-attendance types. These will be used to calculate metrics on the Parameters tab, which will in turn affect the final capacity calculations. A couple of points to note. Non-attendances resulting in a lost slot will generally cover same-day non-attendances, but may include patients who cancel more than a day ahead of their appointment, but where it is not practically possible to call in another patient on short notice. Also, sliders on the Activity tab do not pull data from anywhere else, so you have to input this data manually, either using the boxes or adjusting the sliders. The Parameters tab pulls all of its information from the Demand and Activity tabs, and the information on this page effectively acts as the engine for the calculations in the Summary tab. The sliders are normally set to pull data from historic values entered onto the Activity and Data tabs. If you do choose to enter the data manually, the original and historic values will be shown in parentheses. We recommend that you record the rationale for using alternative values if you're doing so. Anything you see here which does not meet expectations based on operational experience should be investigated.
The Pathway tab allows you to define your desired pathway for both urgent and routine patients. The tabs here differ slightly from other demand and capacity models in that it allows you to define the pathway times from first outpatient through to admission, with the 3 weeks for reasonable notice built in to the system for routine admissions. When setting your pathway timings, it may be helpful to consider a few points. The underlying assumption in this model is that you are running a typical 18-week pathway. Is this reasonable, or do you receive a large number of tertiary referrals with an active RTT clock? Are you looking to depict the service as it currently stands, or are you aiming to provide a view of what you wish to transform your service into? This goes back to ensuring that you have a clear idea of what question you want to ask when setting up the demand and capacity model.
So in summary, the Pathway tab allows you to define your desired pathway for both urgent and routine cases. Please note here that the underlying assumption in this model is that you are running a typical 18-week pathway. Check whether this is reasonable, or if you receive a large number of tertiary referrals with an active RTT clock, you might need to make some adjustments. Finally, think about whether you are looking to depict the service as it currently stands, or whether you are looking for a view of what you wish to transform your service into. This goes back to ensuring that you have a clear idea of the question that you are trying to answer before you set up your demand and capacity model. I'm going to hand back to Keith now, who's going to go through the Sense Checks tab.
We will now review the Sense Check tab. This tab provides 3 sets of sense checks to assist users in determining whether the information they have entered is internally consistent. To provide this check, you will need the waiting list sizes for your first outpatients and admissions at the start and end of the period you drew your activity and referral data from. Looking at each of these checks in turn. First, a comparison of the actual waiting list changes, as listed at the top of the page, compared against a calculated version using data entered in the Activity tab. Significant inconsistencies can be caused by single or multiple factors, and are typically caused where the data items relating to demand, activity, and the waiting list sizes are inconsistent. In other words, the user is not comparing apples with apples. Other potential sources of error can be caused by double counting across 2 or more of the metrics in the Activity tab. For example, counting discharged non-attendances in both the discharged non-attendance and ROT metrics. Secondly, a comparison of activity or demand versus capacity. There may be explainable operational reasons for inconsistencies here. For example, overbooking of clinics, which may result in a usage rate of over 100%, or using follow-up slots for first outpatient appointments, which would then be clearly visible as an imbalance between the 2 capacity usage figures. Finally, the calculated ROT rate, based on the change in the waiting list size compared against the actual ROT figures. If you observe differences here, you may want to consider which of these ROT values to use in your model. The implication of a lower than expected ROT rate would be a need for more capacity, as there would be more patients on the waiting list. So in addition to rechecking your data sources, you may want to manually set the ROT rate to the more conservative or lower value if there is a difference. More generally, you should think about what is considered to be an acceptable level of error relative to the size of your service and relative to the number of patients. A difference of 50 patients may be significant for a small service, but may be entirely acceptable for a larger service, particularly when averaged out over a year, as that would approximately equate to about 1 patient a week. In summary, this worksheet provides some simple assurances or raises questions around the degree of agreement between related data items. It does not guarantee that the numbers are correct.
So the Sense Check tab provides some simple checks on the internal consistency of the data entered into the model. It requires waiting list figures at the start and end of the period covered by your activity and referral information, and it checks changes in the waiting list size, capacity usage, and ROT. Reasons for differences are typically multifaceted, but do check that you are comparing like figures with like figures, so apples with apples, and that you are not double counting data items. Be aware that this page is a very basic sense check. It does not guarantee that your figures are correct. I'm going to hand back to Keith now, who's going to go through the Summary tab.
The Summary tab is where all of the information entered thus far is brought together. Generally speaking, there are a few cells which can be used to provide a reasonable indication of the balance of demand and capacity. the 65th and 85th percentile of demand and currently available capacity for first outpatients. Ideally, you want your capacity to lie somewhere between the 65th and 85th percentile of demand. The sustainable level of capacity required and the currently available capacity for follow-up and admitted patients. And finally, the maximum sustainable waiting list size and the current waiting list size for new and admitted patients. Generally speaking, you'll want to review the figures under the week column. This is based on calculated figures spread evenly across a 52-week period. A note of caution: the values provided here are estimates. The degree of intervention required to rebalance capacities or waiting list sizes is a matter of operational judgment, so the maximum sustainable waiting list value should therefore be viewed as a guide rather than a hard limit. There's an additional level of interdependence in that any potential waiting list clearance for first outpatients will result in follow-on activity for follow-up outpatients and inpatients. This is represented in the waiting list clearance required boxes here and here. All of these are also represented graphically. The green column represents the capacity available, with blue for additional capacity, and yellow represents demand, with red on top showing the waiting list clearance required. In the case of inpatients, the clearance consists of the admitted waiting list clearance, as well as the additional activity required following first outpatient waiting list clearance. This particular mechanic was included to illustrate the potential consequences which often take place when components of a care pathway are examined in isolation. Clearing a backlog in one section often results in simply displacing the problem to another part of the pathway, and the continuation of poor patient experience. The summary page therefore does what it says on the tin, and provides high-level metrics to show the balance of the capacity and demand, the sustainable waiting list size against existing waiting list size, and the effect of waiting list clearances through the whole pathway.
So in summary, the Summary tab does exactly that. It summarises your information. There is a lot of information contained on this tab. However, only a few of these cells are required to gain an idea of the demand and capacity balance of your service. To determine if there is sufficient capacity to deal with what is coming through the door, for first outpatients, average weekly capacity is compared against the 65th and 85th percentile of demand. Demand in this instance is referring to the number of referrals less ROT and accounting for rebookings following non-attendance with a lost slot. For follow-up and outpatients and inpatients, average weekly capacity is compared against the sustainable level required. To determine if the waiting list size is at a sustainable size to meet the expected timeframes for treatment as defined in the Pathway tab, for first outpatients and inpatients, maximum sustainable size is compared against waiting list size. It should be noted that the first outpatient waiting list clearance is also carried forward to follow-up outpatients and inpatients. This models the downstream effect of increased first outpatient activity, assuming patients on the waiting list are cleared within the 12 months. Keith is now going to go through the Planning and Graphs tab.
The Planning tab allows users to add or take away capacity in the future and see the expected effects on the waiting list. This covers first, follow-up, outpatients, and inpatients. This allows for scenario planning to, for example, see the effect of waiting list initiatives, or to proactively plan around known blockages in capacity. As with many of these tools, a note of caution: the model assumes an even distribution of activity and capacity. The waiting list trajectories are therefore based on the interaction between average demand and average capacity, which will not happen in reality. These trajectories are purely illustrative and are intended to give an indication of the likely timescales for recovering an ideal waiting list size. They should not be used to guarantee the date by which an ideal waiting list size would be achieved. The progress of the service can be measured against actual activity by entering the actual activity data in this table here. results of the backlog clearance tab are reflected in the Graphs tab. The projected trajectories are visible here for the scenarios entered against the recommended waiting list size for first outpatient, follow-up outpatient, and admitted patients. You'll note that for follow-up outpatients, the waiting list on the graph starts at 0. This does not imply that there is no waiting list for follow-up patients. In this case, the graph simply shows the projected change in the waiting list size from its current actual position, which is represented as 0. The final chart shown here is a representation of the spread of demand activity, with the mean and the 85th percentile shown against it, an idealized distribution curve. Please note that the curve is not generated directly from historical data, but is calculated using metrics from the data to generate a theoretical distribution curve. This is really for interest only.
So Planning and Graphs tab is also the Backlog Clearance tab. You use these tabs to play with your future capacity and see the effect of increasing or decreasing your capacity on waiting list sizes. Do note, though, that the trajectories won't take account of variation and assumes an even spread of activity and capacity, so it should not be used to guarantee timescales for example, specific waiting list size reductions. And just finally to hand over to Keith to go through the first outpatient and waiting list calculations.
The final tabs we will go through are the first outpatient and inpatient waiting list calculations. These are non-interactive, but are driven by data entered in the Data, Activity, and Pathway tabs. The purpose of these tabs is to show the calculations used to estimate the maximum sustainable waiting list size. For those of you who have attended the one-day theory course, this is a tabular representation of the party hat scheme. As a quick summary, these tabs show the average routine and urgent referrals received per week, distributed evenly amongst the weeks specified for treatment in the Pathway tab. There are a number of patients who were removed from the waiting list via discharges and removals for reasons other than treatment or ROT, and a small number who are rebooked following a non-attendance that results in a lost slot, who are then added back into the waiting list. The total number of patients remaining in the system are cumulatively added, which provides the maximum number of patients who should be waiting at any given moment. If all of this doesn't make much sense, don't worry too much, as this is simply meant as a demonstration of the calculation method. Understanding how to use the outputs is more important in this instance.
So the first outpatient and waiting list calculation tabs are non-interactive, and they're there to show you the calculations used to estimate the maximum sustainable waiting list. Don't worry if this tab doesn't make much sense. Understanding your data and how to use the outputs is much more important. Thank you for watching this video. For more information on the work of the Demand and Capacity team, please go to our website, www.england.nhs.uk, Our Work, Demand and Capacity. Thank you.